Hello and welcome back to Building Your Own Simple Dialogue System tutorial. In this section, we're going to talk about setting up our player and our non-player character and triggering our animation system, opening this panel, and probably get into setting up some of the states. I'm trying to keep the videos at about 30 minutes and keep them separated for you so you can just watch the parts that you need. So all right, in our last section, we set up our dialog panel. We have the text objects here all created nicely inside of a canvas using anchors so that it scales with the screen. We've got our answer panel set up with 4 different answer buttons so that we can toggle each of them. And then I set up the inventory panel and talked about vertical and horizontal layout groups and some quick shortcuts to making a nice looking UI. And so what we're going to do is we're going to leave 2D mode really quick. And one of the things I like to do is remember that everything starts and ends with the player. The first thing that happens is your player hits a trigger or a collider or they push a button or whatever. Your player input causes something to happen. And that's the first thing that we need to get working, is the ability to interact with the player. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to build a 3D object called a plane. And I'm going to scale that up a bunch for fun. I'm going to move it to -0.5. That way I don't have to move the player object and the NPC object and all that stuff. Let's deactivate the dialog panel by default, and this should not be child to the main camera. It should be its own object. There we go. So now I'm going to create another 3D object called a sphere. Stop making it a child. That's annoying. I'm going to call this one the player. Put it 0 and make the scale 1. It just made it as a child object to this plane, so it copied over the scale and made the position proportionate to the plane, so it starts at 0, 0 by default. So when I removed it from being a child of the plane, it had that weird scale and position that we don't want. So to eliminate those errors, we just make it not a child and reset it all to what it should be. I'll make this 0 as well, just put it at the origin. In order to signify this is a little different, I made a material really quick called player material. I'll go ahead and show you how to do that again. It's really quick. All I wanted to do was change the color. So we're going to right click, create new material. This is our player material. I'm going to make a folder for materials called materials and drop our player material in there. And then grab a player object, my materials folder, grab a player object, and in the mesh render under the drop down materials, I'm going to replace this with my player material, and then I'm going to edit the color on this material to, how about red? Red sounds good. That's what I used in the other example, so we'll leave it at red. Making a material is really easy. This is just so that I can have a color here and it doesn't change the default material on everything else. So that's a player. And then I'm going to duplicate that, just hitting Control D. I'm going to move it a couple spaces over. I'm going to replace that material with just the default material. So it's just this white color. And I'm going to call this my NPC, which is non-player character. Yep. So on my player, I'm going to add a, well, the player movement script is really, really simple. if we take a look at it here in Visual Studio, we will see just how simple it is. If you've done the rollerball tutorial, I think that's even more intricate than this. I'm pretty sure there's more parts to it. As soon as this opens, go away. So all this does is I have a serialized field for how fast I want to move, a direction of movement, reference the player rigid body, and some inputs. So all I'm doing is, here's a player rigid body, which is a rigid body attached to this component. So let's make sure that this has, and it doesn't. So let's add component rigid body. Simple enough. We'll just leave these at the defaults, because for what we're doing, it really doesn't matter. In every frame, I'm just getting my input axis horizontal, which by default is A and D, or the left and right arrows, and my get axis vertical, which is just up and down arrows, or WS. And then in fixed update, I'm running a move function, which is right here. Just takes in the axes. And the way these work, these are actually floats. They go from a range of -1 to 1. The vertical axis goes negative when you push down. Obviously, horizontal is negative when you push left. Then all we're doing is just setting movement, which is a vector 3 that's empty from the start. It's empty. And then we're setting it to these axes, and then normalizing it, multiplying it by speed, and time at delta time to keep it independent of frame rate. And then we're just moving the position of the player rigid body, transform position, plus the movement vector we just created. Very simple. Your game probably has something tremendously more complex, but this works for demonstration purposes, so I'm just going to add it onto here instead of remaking it, just because that's not really what this tutorial is about. I'm going to go ahead and test it real quick, make sure it works. Okay, I can move around. Cool. One thing you'll notice is that this will always move on the grid in this way. So if you have like a top-down ISO camera or something that's just following the character and always has the same angle, then this is fine. But most things require something a little more robust than just that. But this will work for now. Okay, so that's our player. Pretty well set up. I usually, as soon as I finish something, I'm going to create a folder called Prefabs. And inside of my prefabs, I'm just going to save this player, because you need a player in every scene, for the most part. Unless it's like a menu scene or like a loading scene or something like that, you almost always have a player, and it's really annoying to try to reset up all this stuff every time, or like start with an empty game object and then I'll add all this stuff, or go to the sphere and do what I just did to put it all together. And like I almost forgot to put the rigid body on it. So if you make a prefab, then I can just drag this into the scene, and here it is with everything all set up, and it's really handy. And all I did to create that was just click and drag down to the prefabs folder, and bam, we have a prefab. Awesome. Okay, so for our non-player character, what we need here is, by default, it creates a sphere collider, as well as our mesh renderer, and it obviously has a transform. So our sphere collider, we don't want to actually collide with the player, because what we're going to do is we're going to scale this up a bunch to make it decent sized, and then when the player collides with this, excuse me. When the player collides with this collider, we don't want to stop the player from moving through it, because right now, I walk towards my non-player character, and there's this invisible wall that I smack into every time. And yeah, that's decent if you want to do that. But really, for a dialogue system, you want to be able to walk up to the player. We'd probably have a solid collider on the actual sphere, and then this would be a separate collider for the dialogue itself. This would be specifically a dialogue collider, and you can do two colliders on one object. So I have the two, and I'm going to go ahead and make this big one. I'm going to make that a trigger. That way it doesn't stop my collision. It just sets off a trigger. It just sets off an event saying, hey, this thing just collided with me, so do stuff. And we'll get into that code in just a minute. But now I can move through the trigger, and then I hit the solid collider when I actually hit the player. So it's fine to have two colliders on an object. Unity supports that. I'm going to remove this just to keep it consistent with what I already had set up. I'm trying to change as little as possible for you. So here's our NPC. Here's our trigger collider set up here. So what we need to do is first set up what happens when my player intersects my dialog trigger. And the way we do that is we're going to create a new script. Well, I guess really what we're going to use is a dialog trigger. I don't know, I'm going to recreate these or not. Yeah, no, I told you I was going to recreate these. I'm going to. I'm going to create a new script called put dialog trigger. So what we're going to do in here, we're going to open it up and reload. That's fine. Okay. I'm going to close all this stuff out. Just keep this nice and tidy so it's easier to look at. So for our dialog trigger, what we want to do is we want to use a default function in Unity, void on trigger enter. And with the latest update in Unity, we get this nice completed function shell here that we can use. We see that we're getting a reference to the collider that hit us. So this dialog trigger goes on the NPC object themselves. I'm going to go ahead and do that now for clarity. So when the player hits, or when a collider hits, I want to ask, is it the player? So I'm going to say if other dot, let's do compare tag to player. Okay, then I'm going to want to do stuff. And whenever I set up a tag like this, I usually end up doing it in code and saying, oh yeah, I need a player tag for the player because like I need it right here. And as soon as you set this up, like finish this line and go immediately back to the editor, select my player, say, okay, I need a tag called player. Cool. And if you don't have the tag by default, you just click add tag down here, and you can create a custom tag that's like sandwich, and then if I have an object here that I want to call a sandwich, I just select the tag to sandwich, and that works. Very simple, very straightforward. No, I don't have any tags. That's fine. Player is a default tag. I end up using it more often than not. So if our tag is the player, then we want to look at another component here on our non-player character is we need to have an animator. And the animator is a state machine. It's what Unity calls state machines. If we go over here to our Animator window, we can see this is an animator. This dialog system that I showed you earlier, this is the one in the final product. This is just an animator, and it's called the example conversation controller. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder in here called conversation controller. Because I already have that folder somewhere. So in this conversation controller, I'm going to create a new animator controller, and I'm going to call this tutorial NPC dialog. Alright, and then on my NPC object in the animator component, I'm going to drag this controller onto the controller space here. And by default, I want this animator to be off. Because when I trigger it, I want to turn this animator on. And then I want it to do specific things every time that I turn it on. So when I turn it on, I want it to go to that first state, that hello state. So to do that, I want it to start off, because I don't want it to run anything without the player around. This is also good practice if you have a bunch of NPCs around, or you've got a fairly open world or sandbox. You don't want all of them to have an active state machine at all times when you're not talking to them, you're not communicating, you're nowhere near them, they're on the opposite side of the map. Why would you need a state machine running every frame asking what state it's in when it's just going to return the same state and not do anything that the player will actually see? So this kind of saves on your cycles, and it's substantially more efficient as you scale up. Sorry, if we look in this animator, what we have first is entry, which is as soon as we enter, which is normally called on start or awake or on enable, then we're going to make a transition to go to our first state. Then we have any state, which allows us to go as long as this system is active. If something happens, then we can move to a different state. And then this exit state, which for the most part I don't recommend using unless you have a one-off animation that you want it to run, and then you want it to get out of the animator and not have to worry about something else deactivating it or deactivating it in code. Just go to exit and it's done. It won't run again, and it sort of helps you keep that clean. So I'm going to go back to my code in this dialog here. I want to say if get component animator dot is active and enabled. So what I'm asking is, if this object is active, if the game object is active and the component animator is enabled, actually I'm going to ask if it's not enabled. So if it's not enabled, what I'm going to do is get component animator, and I'm going to enable it by enabled equals true. So if it's not enabled, go ahead and enable it. But either way, the player just collided with us. So what we want to do is get component animator dot, I want to set bool. And I'm going to make a bool called is conversating, and I want to set that to true. Okay. This is just a general a boolean that I like to set on my state machines, or my dialog state machines, that just says we are actively talking. And if we're ever not talking, then ignore everything and don't worry about the UI. Don't worry about what the player's inputting. because we're not talking, so it doesn't matter. It just eliminates errors overall. Next, we are going to get component animator again, and we're going to play a specific state called hello. And the reason I manually have it play hello, I talked about this in the intro video, that this is a design choice. That whenever the player re-enters the conversation and starts over, I want it to start at the beginning. I don't want it to start wherever it left off, because there's a chance that it left off in the goodbye function, which could just start and then immediately close, and inside of one frame it opened and closed and nothing happened. The player doesn't see anything and it just looks like it's not working, but really it is. It's just playing from the wrong state. So play it from the first state every time, and that'll save you a headache later on. Oh, and we want to make sure that we start this at layer 0. That just lets it know. If you look at our state machine, we have 2 components, layers and parameters. Layers are for if you want to run different state machines based on some other factor in your game. Like, for example, I had a game where you could be friendly to NPCs and then they would reward you, or if you were mean to them, then they would attack you or not give you things or have totally different dialogue. So I would make a new layer that was like, this is my angry layer. And then in this layer, I can create a new state here that's like, be upset. And then I can make my base layer not have that state in it. Then I can toggle those layers. For this tutorial, we don't need to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and undo and just get rid of that. Because we don't need it. For this tutorial, making something that simple, just as long as you know it's there. So this just by default says, go to the base layer. Again, eliminating bugs by specifically stating which layer it's on. Okay, okay, so the next thing we're going to set up is a way to make sure that this is working. Because right now it's triggering when the player collides. All it's doing is saying, okay, if the animator is enabled or isn't enabled, go ahead and enable it, or else just set bool is conversating to true. So we're going to go over here to our animator on the NPC here. Touch NPC dialog is what's open here in the animator window. We're going to go to parameters, and we're going to make a new bool called is conversate. By default, it's going to be false. So we're going to create an empty state, and we're going to call it hello, just like every other state. Now, another thing I found that works really nice is this initial state. If we set its speed to 5, it just makes it feel a little more snappy, and it kind of pops up faster, and seems to throw fewer errors in the long term. All of the other states that we make, we'll set the speed to 1, but for this one, we're going to set it to 5. So next we're going to create our dialog manager next. So we're going to create an empty game object, and we're going to call it dialog manager. And in here we need to have a new script called dialog manager. And this script needs to go on the dialog manager. Handy. Alright, and then I want to hit that script as well. So for my dialog manager, I probably don't need all this stuff, so I'm going to delete it. Unity and Visual Studio have some weird issues every once in a while. I'm hitting Control S to save, but as you can see, this asterisk is still here. And if we go back into Unity, this is just a common bug. I see it all the time. And we look at our dialog manager script, we can see that it hasn't updated because for whatever reason it's decided it doesn't need to save this. No matter how many times I tell it to, it's like, no, I don't feel like it. So one of the tricks is you click the normal save button and then you click save all, and for whatever reason that works. And then save it again, just cause. And now it's updated. So there's a little backdoor trick for you. This save all button seems to do more. And if that doesn't work, close the script itself from Visual Studio, and it gives you a dialog that says, hey, are you sure you want to close this without saving? And say, no, I'm not stupid. Go ahead and save it. And for whatever reason, that works too. Don't ask me why. It's just the way it is. Ask the Unity guys. So for our dialog manager, our dialog manager script needs to have a reference to the Animator controller called the Animator, and that's going to be the current animator. And by default, it's not going to equal anything. It's going to equal null. But we want to store whatever our current animator is so that we only run one. Because you only want to run one animation at a time. Because you don't want to be talking to multiple people at the same time. We have situations in games all the time, especially if you look at like Bethesda games like Fallout. You'll have 3 or 4 guys in a room that you're able to talk to, and whichever one you're closer to is the one that it seems to go with, and that's very carefully crafted so that they don't overlap. Because we create this sphere of area you can walk into and have dialogue with me, and then if I made another NPC that was like right here, you see those spheres pretty handsomely overlap. Let's move them a little farther away, I guess. So whichever one you're closer to, I want to set as, or whichever one you intersect first, I want to set as your current animator. And then if you intersect another one, and this animator is not equal to null anymore, it's equal to that other animator, then I don't want to run the animation of that other guy, because then I have 2 scripts manipulating the text and asking me for the same answers and moving through separate dialogue trees. And that just doesn't. That's just bad. Just don't do that. That's obviously bad. I don't need to explain why. Let's do it again. All right. So we have a reference to our current animator, and then we're gonna need a serialized field, and it's gonna be a game object called the dialog panel. Now, a serialized field, I know you don't see this a lot in tutorials. It kind of frustrates me because serialized fields work tremendously better than public variables because this is still encapsulated as a private variable. I just want to set it one time to be my dialog system. And I want it to show up here in the editor. So this is what a serialized field does. It shows up here in the editor, and then I can go to my dialog panel, and I can just drag it right there. And now I have a reference to that dialog panel. As opposed to doing a public variable, which I can then expose to everything else and change and potentially break during the middle of my game. I don't really want to do that. I want it to stay encapsulated. Public variables also take tremendous amounts of overhead, whereas serialized fields are a lot easier. When you go to when you get down to like a final production level, where you're really trying to optimize your code, you would probably say dialog panel equals GameObject.find. And then you'd type in the actual name of the object. No, yeah, that would work fine. So like, this would give me my dialog panel, assuming that I named it dialog panel every time, and I spelled it perfectly exactly the same every time. And like I mentioned earlier, prefabs are amazing. This is yet another great use of prefabs. You can see in my final project, I have an inventory and dialog canvas here that has my dialog panel that's already named dialog panel. So inside of my code, I can just hardwire or hard code that name to save a little bit of space over using a serialized field if you're that worried about it. But come final runtime, yeah, that'll matter. Or come final build, yeah, that'll matter. But for this right now, I don't think it's all that important. So let's jump back over and we'll get rid of this. So we now have a reference to our dialog panel. And I want to create a public function. And I'm going to call it... Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay, so I'm going to create a public function called activate dialog panel. That sounds intense. So all this is going to do, let's say void function, not to return anything. So all this is going to do is dialog panel set active true. So all that's going to do is activate it, and then I'm going to make another one for deactivate dialog panel. Actually, I'm going to do this different. I'm going to say set active dialog panel, and I'm going to pass in a bool. So that way I can use it for both activate and deactivate. So I can just set it active or inactive, true or false, from anywhere in my code without referencing the panel itself, but just having a reference to the dialog manager. You'll see when we start working in states, I'm going to use that ugly GameObject.find function because every state has to reference it, and I don't want to be setting that in serialized fields or public variables. And dragging and dropping it inside of the editor because that just takes way too much time. So I'm going to grab a reference to this dialog manager, only risking it breaking once, set up a nice little debug log if it does throw up an error, and go from there. So next, we have our dialog manager set up with a reference to our dialog panel, and we have the ability to turn the panel on and off. Okay. So when we intersect our dialog trigger here, dialog trigger on our NPC object, I want to, I'm enabling my animator here. Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay, so my player has intersected with, my player has activated this trigger, and I'm going to get a reference to my dialog manager. So I need a dialog manager. I'm going to make this GameObject.find dialog manager. And get component, dialog manager. And the reason I'm doing it this way is, again, I'm grabbing the dialog manager multiple times in this fashion. So if it breaks, it's going to break everywhere. And I know I'm going to have to do this in my states. So doing it in my dialog trigger just saves me a step when I set up this dialog trigger on my NPC object. It saves me the step of directly addressing the dialog manager every time in the editor. So instead I get just this line of code. And actually we're going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit by declaring the variable separately. And then we're going to use a try catch statement. Just in case somebody messes up, we're going to catch a system.exception, and we're going to throw new system.exception. Scene must contain an object called dialog manager. I'll remove the space just for clarity. With a dialog manager component attached. Simple enough. So that will print out in my system log, or in my console, as an error. It'll throw this instead of the default, hey, I'm broken. It throws something that sort of makes sense. So, like, let's say I've got this dialog trigger on my NPC, and let's say I think if I deactivate this object, it should do it. Pretty sure that does it. So then it's looking for it, and it says, oh, wait, I don't know where the dialog manager is. Scene must contain an object called dialog manager with dialog manager component attached. That way it's very straightforward and simple, and your level designer can look at it and go, oh, well, apparently I need to create an object called dialog manager, and hey, there's probably a prefab for that, so they'd look for that. Just helps you out along the way as you build more levels and more scenes. Again, we'll get all this set up in prefabs to make that all easy for you. But now that we have a reference to the dialog manager, we then need to tell it some stuff. I want to tell it the current conversation controller is equal to this. Not specifically this. Get component animator. What does that look like? Set that up as current animator. This can be a game object though, actually, because this is all going to be always on an NPC. Yeah, this will work. So this is always going to be on an NPC, this dialog trigger. Now the dialog trigger is a component on the game object that is the non-player character. So the dialog manager basically just needs a reference to say, hey, let's make sure our current animator, or our current NPC that we're running dialogue through is the right one, right? I'm going to save that reference right here. Just save game object, which is the NPC itself. Okay. Next, we're going to do dialog manager dot I could have sworn I made a public function just a minute ago. Set active dialog panel. Yeah. And I'm going to set that to true. That really doesn't make any sense at all, actually. Yeah, so it's a public function. Let's try compiling it. See what that does. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Oh, that's because this isn't a dialog manager. Tutorial dialog manager. Why is that? Because this is public. No, I'm forgetting my head today. Current animator. My game object. Okay. Okay, so the next thing I want to build here is, well, let's see this first, actually. So now when I trigger from the player, I should enable my animator, that bool is conversating, and play the state hello, get a reference to my dialog manager, and then set the current animating object to this object, and set the active dialog panel to true. So I want to turn the dialog panel on. So let's see if that works. Here we are in our scene, and bam, look at that. We got a dialog panel, complete with buttons. Look at that. Look at how pretty that is. Alright. So that tells me that this trigger script is working, for the most part. And actually, if I look at the animator while I'm doing this, I can see that the animator component is off, and then when I trigger, it turns on, and I'm entering the state, hello. Okay. So that means we are all ready to start setting up dialog states, and we're going to work on state enter and exit, and starting and ending dialog, and moving through multiple answers, and how to do that intuitively using just the state machine from Unity alone. No fancy node editors or anything. Too snazzy, something you can just really build by yourself and build off of. So I'm going to start doing that in the next video. Looks like we're going pretty long on time. So I'm going to break it up again. And yeah, so I'll see you next time for state machines.